Hello, you're listening to a special episode of Web-Standard Podcast. I'm your host, Vadim from HTML Academy. Today, I'm in Sunnyvale, California, with special guest Rachel Andrew. Hello, Rachel, and tell us a bit about yourself.
Hello. I'm Rachel Andrew. I have been doing things on the web for a very long time, but probably sort of the most interesting thing, I guess, for listeners here is that I'm a member of the CSS working group. And I also represent Frontiers, a Dutch organisation of web developers on the W3C.
All right, going deeper into you're basically a freelancer, right?
Yes, yeah.
But the most of the CSS working group and W3C representatives or members are working for bigger companies, and just a few of them are freelancers because it's really hard to do such thing on your own. How does freelancing work for you? Is this something you're enjoying to do?
Yeah, I mean, I've been self-employed since 2001, so I've not had a proper job for a very long time.
All right.
And so I do a bunch of different things. So I'm editor-in-chief of Smashing Magazine, and I still build websites sometimes. And also, Frontiers give me a stipend to sort of help towards the work that I do within the W3C. Because if you aren't a sort of part of a member company, so, you're not from Google or Microsoft or someone who's a member of the W3C, you can get into a working group as an invited expert, which is what I was. Mm-hmm. If you are an invited expert, you essentially get an expensive hobby because you have to fund yourself. You have to fund traveling to the meetings and the time you spend actually working on CSS or whichever group you're in. You're funding that yourself. So part of what Frontiers are doing is helping to fund that activity, which gives me a bit of time essentially to work on these things.
We will go back to CSS working group and the related stuff, but I want to discuss a bit your other projects. Mm-hmm. I've been following you on Twitter for a long time, and I remember you're working on the Purge CMS mm-hmm. and then Noticed. Can you tell us a bit about those projects?
Yeah, sure. So we've got a couple of products. I run a company with my husband, Drew McClellan, and we've had Perch for over 10 years. We actually started that. It's a small content management system mm-hmm. Written in PHP. We're both PHP developers. So that's essentially a system for small websites which sort of doesn't sort of try and take over the entire system. And it's template based. You can write templates, however you want. And we just deal with the content management side of it. So that's Perch, and that's still, is quite a big chunk of our business really is supporting Perch and developing Perch. And then because I've been doing a ton of public speaking, and I kind of wanted a product that would let me build a sort of portfolio site. And so I was sort of saying this to Drew, and saying it would be really good to have all these different things. And that's really where Noticed came from, which is essentially a SaaS app to build your public speaking portfolio. So that's a really good fun project because of all the content as well that we're now seeing on the site, because people are uploading their slides and videos and things. So that's really cool.
So I remember similar services like that. SlideShare comes to mind, and there used to be Lanyard. Yeah. And Lanyard is dead these days. And SlideShare, it's like a LinkedIn project. And then because LinkedIn is blocked in Russia, it's also not available in Russia as well. Oh, right. So we don't really have a choice. And what's in there for speakers, for developers in Noticed?
Yeah, we've got a kind of tagline of more than just slide sharing. So we think there's various places you can upload slides to, but there's other stuff that goes along with the talk. And that was really what I wanted to get to, is having somewhere to, put all the code pens and the resources and, the links that you share. And
sort of a scrapbook.
Yeah, sort of all that stuff that goes along with a presentation. Because when I do a talk, there's usually, 10 or more CodePen examples and a whole bunch of resources. And then after the talk, you've got the video and you've got tweets that you collect, that people have said, and you want to store those somewhere. So that's kind of the idea, is you can now do a page for presentation that has all of that stuff together in one place. I'm Noticed / Rachel Andrew. You can see on mine, there's a whole bunch of those kind of examples.
All right. My favorite way of delivering talks is writing them in HTML and CSS. Mm-hmm. So I'm an author of this shower presenter engine. So basically, it's like HTML file with some CSS. And is it possible to host a presentation like this on Noticed?
Yeah, you can just embed just about anything. I think we've got a bunch of people who use HTML slides, so we support those as well.
So basically, really it's an iframe.
Yeah.
Okay.
So really, whatever format we want to try and support that we see people using.
So I once you noticed, I registered. I need to spend more time building my profile there, but I think it's a lovely service. It's not like other services focusing on getting more people together or providing some super features, but it's just it looks like a personal website.
Well, yeah, that's it. It's really, your sort of portfolio of stuff. The interesting thing is that now we're getting so much content on the site that we're trying to figure out ways to sort of expose that and let people explore it. So we've got a bit of an explore page where you can sort of look at all the videos that people have added, and there's like masses of content now, which is really, that's kind of a totally like another side of it. We thought about the individuals putting their stuff out there, but now it's actually becoming a really useful resource if you want to go and look for things about CSS Grid, or, you'll find a whole collection of stuff. And that's really interesting to see that stuff.
Yeah, thank you for building this. I think we're, after Lanyard dying, I think it was a new hope for developers to host their portfolio.
Yeah, I hope so.
Going back to Frontiers, and you're representing it in W3C. I've seen the list of W3C members. It's a list of like 435 organizations, and I don't think all of them are active in the same way. I think it depends on how big company is and what their interests are, and what role you're trying to play representing Frontiers in W3C.
Well, I think it's Frontiers are interested in actually web developers as just web developers, not as part of their company. Should have a sort of a say, because obviously there are people involved in the W3C who are web developers. There's people from, all kinds of companies that use the web. There are people from automotive companies and people from publishing and so on. I think that Frontiers thought that, well, we're a community of web developers. We might work for big companies, some of us, and other people are freelance, but we've individually got this kind of voice, I think. And we care about what happens with the web, because this is where we work. We might be working for a big company now, one of these large organizations, but we're also a person who does web development and wants to do this as a career. And I think that that's really what we're trying to be, is that voice, is the voice of just individuals who build websites.
I believe Frontiers is the first case when a community of developers decided to send their representative to W3C. Can you imagine more communities doing so, or how hard it was for Frontiers? I guess they got the main problem. They solved the main problem by running a successful Frontiers conference. So they managed to get a budget for that. And what were other challenges, and how's it going?
I think one of the challenges is just the whole way the W3C is set up is that each organization that's a member has, one representative who goes to the main sort of the main meetings, the advisory committee meetings. So for Frontiers, that's me. It's kind of set up that it assumes you're part of a big company. It assumes that you've got all those structures in place, to go to the meeting, to get the information, to take that back and to put it into whatever kind of system you have for spreading information through your company. And if there's, say, a question that needs to be asked or something that needs to be voted on, you've already got that structure set up. If you're a representative of an organization, it's a volunteer organization, you don't have any of those, because these are just people who turn up to meetings, And so it's figuring out how to do that. And I think that maybe the Frontiers sort of experiment can become a bit of a model for how that might work. And that's one of the things that I'd like to do, certainly, over the next year, is to kind of write a bit of that, how does an organization fit into this model, which is very much set up for giant companies with existing structures.
But does it work? I mean, it's obvious that you're trying to make it work, but how is it?
I think it does. But there's been a lot of interest at the W3C from people there. I think it's probably helped that I was a known person already. I think that is something that would need to be explored further, in terms of, there are people who do standards work who don't have the profile that I have. My profile helps because people know of me, because I've been doing this stuff for so long, and there's so much of my stuff out there on the internet. So, I mean, that does help, having someone who's got profile. I think that would be something to explore as well. How do we get people involved who are talented at standards work, but aren't people who want to be standing on stage talking about it, and who aren't people who want to be writing vast amounts of stuff? And I think that is a different question, because there are a lot of very talented people involved with standards work whose name you'll never know because they don't get out there into the public eye. But there's been interest, and I think that there certainly is a need for feedback from web developers. There's a need for that to get into the process. Like at CSS working group meetings, always there's this, what do authors actually want here? And they'll look at me, like a voice of every author. And I'm like, well, there's a few of us who have got an idea from our sort of place that we sit, or perhaps I've talked to people at conferences. But having a group means that I can go back to them and say, this question's been asked. You're a large group of web developers who are doing lots of different things. What do you think? And then take that information back. So I think there's reasons to do this. It's just, we've got to figure out actually how that really works.
So at W3C, you're representing Frontiers community. So are you still invited expert at the CSS working group, or you're...
So I'm sort of changed to a member status in the CSS working group, while this experiment's going on. I presume they'll still want me. And if the Frontiers thing ends, I will end up just going back to being invited. Right. And that happens, people say, people have like worked for Microsoft and then they've left Microsoft and gone to a company that isn't a member of the W3C. And so then it's just like, oh, should we vote this person as an invited expert? Well, yes, obviously,
we need him.
Yes. Once they've got you in, you're probably going to stay. Like most committees, you don't get ejected. You tend to. It's the opposite is true.
Once you prove that you're valuable for the process and you're
what your status is really is essentially process. And it is going to change, and it does change. People move from company to company. Yeah. So someone might be a member of the CSS working group representing Mozilla at one meeting, and then show up and they're now representing Google because they've changed jobs. So that's not an unusual thing to happen anyway.
Okay, but what's your focus in CSS working group? Because a number of CSS specs is huge, but what's your favorite ones and what you're trying to focus on?
Well, so it tends to be layout. That's the thing that I know best. So I tend to have most to say about anything that touches layout, really.
Do you have some background related to that, or it was just you just chose to?
It's just sort of what happened. I think it came from it comes from a long way back when we first started using CSS at all for layout. So coming out of using tables for layout, I was one of the sort of first people to have a site and have built sites using CSS. My company started in 2001. I never built a site using tables for layout while that company existed. So I was one of the very early people doing that and writing about it and explaining how to do it. So I've been teaching CSS layout for as long as that's really been a thing. And I was also involved with Dreamweaver when I was on the Web Standards project. So I was on the Web Standards project essentially to try and encourage Dreamweaver to output better code. And it was Macromedia at the time, not Adobe.
Yeah, I remember.
So working on the betas and things. But a lot of that was about that visual view, of that visual sort of code view in Dreamweaver, which was really great for doing nested table stuff.
Oh, of course. I remember opening Dreamweaver only to create a complicated table.
Yes, exactly.
Because it was easier.
It was fantastic for that. And where that all started to fall apart was when we went to CSS for layout, because there was no real way for a visual tool to represent that. But that sort of idea of being able to do layout visually, it always interested me, and I don't know why, it just sort of did. Which I think is why when I saw grid, I saw the idea of grid layout, I was so excited about that, because I was like, this is exactly what we've been waiting for. And so just layout kind of caught my interest, I think. And also being involved with content management systems. I've built a lot of CMSs as well as Perch. Being involved in that side of things. I think, this idea of being able to create components and lay them out and know what they're going to be like once they're actually in the site and dealing with different types and shapes of content. All of this stuff kind of comes together that sort of makes me someone who's probably ideal to be thinking about layout, really.
Okay. Well, what specs you can call layout specs? Like grids, flags, multi-column?
Multi-column, anything that hangs off display, really. And then there's all this sort of joining specs, so things like box sizing, box alignment, right. All those things that touch that. So it tends to be all of that sort of stuff. I'm not really an animations person. if I have to use transitions animations, I have to go look it up. I can recite chunks of the Flex and Grid spec, but I have to, because I so rarely do anything with animations. So I'm like, oh, what's that look like again? And I always say that to people, and they're like, oh, how am I ever going to learn all of this? I'm like, those of us who actually work on CSS itself don't know all of this. So, we do tend to, and in the CSS working group, there are people who, there are the font people, and there's people who have different areas of expertise. And at the meetings, they'll just be very quiet, and then their thing comes up, and then they pop up and are like, oh, I need to do that. They get very animated. It's my thing now. So, I mean, in the meetings, everyone obviously has a say, and sometimes something will be something that seems unrelated, but I'll be like, oh, I've heard people talking about that, and then I might jump in or say, or do a bit of research. Where did I hear people talking about that? Find it and chip that in, because I often hear stuff at conferences and things. But I mean, so everyone's involved in everything really, but people do have an area of expertise.
Well, more or less, we know what's going on with Flexbox and grids, because Flexbox is our baseline these days. Mm-hmm. Grid is something new still. But for multiple column layout, I used to work for Opera browser in DevRel for a while. And I remember there was a really strong implementation in Opera 5-7 years ago or around that time. And I've been playing with multiple columns because I was trying to build demos that would show capabilities to browsers, like Object Fit, one of the first implementations, like multiple columns and things like that. So I know some things about the multiple column layout, but most of the developers, they know how to make 2 columns, and that's it. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't really, and still not quite popular among developers. Do you know why?
Yeah, I mean, so multi-column. So I'm actually the co-editor of the spec, and most of the sort of recent work that's gone into the spec is I've been editing in. There's a few things with multi-col. One is that it isn't actually that useful for a lot of web layouts, because you don't want to end up having to kind of scroll up and down in the block dimension to view stuff.
Yeah, that was the main reason.
Yeah, so that's a big reason not to use multi-col. For you can't use it for large amounts of content.
It's not like it was created for the web. Probably they had web in mind while creating it, but I think they were trying to recreate print design first.
I think to some extent it is, of course, used massively in print user agents. So that's a really important thing with multi-col. So this sort of scrolling on and on and on forever is something that we would like to deal with in level 2 of the spec, and we've got some ideas of how that's going to work. So you could say, oh, I've got a box which is so high, which might be 100 VH high, so the size of your viewport basically, and if you fill it with columns, then you could create another box below that, which would mean you'd never get columns that were taller than your viewport. So that sort of idea would be something that we'd like to try and do, but at the moment, really, my work on that spec is to fix it up. Because the other reason that no one uses multi-col is that it is full of bugs and broken in all the browsers. And the reason is because it was sort of abandoned in about 2013.
All right.
So basically, no one really worked on the spec for a few years.
I thought it was just browser's fault, not implementing it properly.
No, well, you see, because this development is a circular process. You write CSS specifications in the CSS working group, and then browsers start to implement them, and they will find problems when they start to implement, and then they will come back to the CSS working group and say, hey, there's problems with this spec, you need to fix the spec. Now, if there's no one at that end to pick up those issues and fix it, the browsers aren't going to carry on implementing, because they'll be like, well, this spec is too vague, we're just going to end up with loads of interop issues, so let's just not do anything about it. Right. So, I mean, you need to have this kind of circular process. It's not a case of we write a spec and throw it over the fence and say, there you go, we're done.
But how many circles does it take to...
It depends on the spec. Some things are quite, and the feature, some things are quite simple and may well have been kind of really sort of hashed out in the working group by the people who might be working on those features, because that happens sometimes. You've got the actual engineers sat there and they can say, oh, that's going to be, we can do that in our engine or we can't. But something like, multi-col, it was a very, very vague spec. It was like older specs tended to be essentially just like a stack of examples and no really robust text to say, when you implement this, these are the steps you have to go through. And this is where it gets this size from. And so there's lots of vague stuff. So a good example of that is that Mozilla going to, in the next version of Firefox, so 71, they're going to ship column span. So Firefox is not...
It's been available for a while in other browsers.
Yes, yeah. Other browsers had column span for a long time. Firefox has not had column span, and because there's this whole raft of issues that had never been resolved. So that's what we've been sort of working on fixing those. They've been doing the implementation, coming back to us, and then we've been trying to work out how those things work. Because it turns out actually that column span is reasonably complex.
So and quite useful.
Yeah, so that's really what happened. I think there's the two reasons why people don't use multicol. One is that it's only really useful in very specific circumstances on the web. And the other is that we had lots and lots of browser bugs. Not all of those are actually to do with multicol. A lot of them are to do with fragmentation, which is poorly implemented in browsers generally. So this is
even page break things.
So this is the break before, break after, and break inside properties, which were in CSS2 page break before, page break after.
I've been trying to create a multi-column layout for Dev Opera main page redesign in 2013, I believe, and I've been struggling. Trying to tell browsers not to move this heading to the next column, for example. I've been juggling with a page break, avoid, and things like that, and it wasn't possible in all browsers.
It's still not possible. So I've got an article on Smashing Magazine, so I went through all of these properties and tried to figure out exactly which combination would best work. Yeah. So the break inside avoid property works pretty well, but that's about the only one. The before and afters really don't work well. So so a lot of the multicol issues are actually fragmentation issues, because when you break something into...
Is it different spec?
Yes, it's two specs.
All right.
Yeah. So because fragmentation deals with fragmentation, so multicol is more like breaking a document into pages than anything else. It's the same thing. If you break a chunk of text into columns, each column box is essentially like a page. So fragmentation deals with multicol, paged media, and the region spec, although of course we've not got an implementation of regions now. But that would be the other fragmentation spec. So it sort of deals with any of these things that need to be broken, whether it's between columns or boxes.
The next topic that comes in mind after multi-column layout is printing. And just like you said, there is a use case for multi-column layout in printing, and there are some user agents using web technologies to actually print something to paper and trying to replace old publishing systems with web technologies. And what those are? Prince XML?
Yeah.
I know this one.
There's Prince, there's Antenna House. There's a few of them. Prince and Antenna House are probably the two really big ones that you hear of a lot, but there are other things too.
Are those implementations are completely independent from browser engines, right?
Yes. So basically they're user agents, as a browser is user agent, but they're user agents that output to print. They typically they support the paged media spec, which is the spec which defines things like page sizes and paper sizes and margins, and allows you to do things like use generated content to put page numbering and titles and things into the margin boxes. But other than that, they just implement CSS. You can just style things like you can on the web, basically.
I guess that they can just keep implementing transitions and animations because, it's paper.
But so they've got a bunch of things which we don't have on the web. So something that I'm very interested in is this crossover between the two worlds, because I think that more and more we're creating things on the web which are more like page documents. But we don't have all the features that you have if you are creating a book, for example, with CSS. And we don't have the ability to control things in the same way. So I think that's quite interesting. That interests me, this idea of, there's no reason why something that we're publishing on the web shouldn't be like a set of pages that you swipe through. But it's actually quite hard to do at the moment. Because of the way that the web assumes that you've just got this continuous scroll, and which you don't. The minute you work in page media, you're always working with which fragment am I working with at the moment? As I say, it's like working inside a column box.
The obvious thing that stays in between web and printing is ebooks. In EPUB, they use web technologies, and they building something closer to. Well, they're trying to render it as close to typical book layout as possible. So this is something that's another use case for such spec.
And if you open up an EPUB, you'll find usually XHTML and CSS inside. Yes, there's all these different things. And that's the thing about being on the CSS working group and why a lot of this stuff takes a lot longer than people think it really ought to, because we're not just thinking about the browser. We're thinking about all these other things that consume CSS. Yep. We've got issues in multicol at the moment, which we're trying to solve, which are difficult because we don't want to sort of end up sort of forking the spec and print things doing one thing and browsers doing another. So, that is something that comes up. And I think that's one of the reasons why this stuff is harder than people realize, because, not a lot of web developers have got no idea the fact that the book they're reading was printed using CSS.
I think Leah Verou's CSS Secrets book was printed from HTML and CSS.
A lot of SitePoint do all of theirs because I helped them do their system initially.
Oh, right.
I've done quite a bit of this stuff. I love doing it. I love using CSS for print. It's such fun because you've got this final output that it's not going to change. it's like you sort of say best viewed on the computer in my room.
You wouldn't resize your book, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it is quite fun because you can do the sort of stuff that you could never do on the web. So that's why we've got things in CSS for print that we don't have yet on the web, because it's easier to do when you kind of know exactly what the shape and size of the thing is.
It's a silly question to ask, like, why wouldn't browser just, and something, but I still want to ask it. Why wouldn't browser just implement all the specs related to print? So I would just press print from the browser itself and would get the PDF that's fully capable for printing.
There's no reason why they couldn't. And what a lot of people are doing these days is they're generating PDFs sort of for invoices and stuff by using a headless browser and converting it to PDF. But what you get there is only what the browser can do if you hit print, which is limited because of the fragmentation issue and so on. So really it's just, I think a lot of that stuff, and again, this is something I've written about on Smashing, I think a lot of it is just that no one is asking for it. And ultimately, browsers implement the things that there is demand for. No one is asking for better print, really. We don't see rafts of bugs, although everyone's having to do it. It's terrible. People aren't demanding it. And so I think that, that's the thing really with any of these things we want in browsers, we have to actually say that's what we're after and that we need and we have use cases for. And a lot of the reason why I write this stuff up is to try and see if there's interest, or try and encourage interest, or try and encourage other people to come out of the woodwork and say, hey, yes, me too, I wanted that as well. Because I think a lot of developers don't realize the power that we have as a community to actually get this stuff into browsers, and it's why I sort of essentially campaigned for Grid for so long. Because I wanted other people to be like, yes, we need this. And it not just be me. So I think, it's always worth writing and talking about the stuff that you want and that you think should be there, because sometimes it's just that there's been no business case made for actually doing it.
All right, maybe the last topic, but we'll see how it goes. Display property. You started this series on Smashing Magazine. I believe there were 3 articles, maybe more. And recently, I think the Firefox shipped support for multiple, for two values support in display property. Could you briefly explain why would we even need that?
Okay. So when these are the things that are really hard to talk about, but easy to show in code. But so when you say display, what you're actually saying, so if you say display flex, what you're actually saying is, what does the outer box do and what do its children do? So in the case of saying display flex, what you're actually saying is create me a block level box, because the outer will become block level. It'll do the things that block level stuff does with flex children. We have got what is now termed a legacy value of display inline dash flex, which will give you an inline level box.
An inline grid.
And so on. Okay, so a value of display already means 2 things. It means what does my outer do and what does my children do? And so what this 2-value syntax is doing is kind of making that very clear. So you can say display block flex because I want to have a block level box of flex children, display inline flex because I want an inline box of flex children.
But for backward compatibility, if you still say display flex, display block will be added by default.
Yeah. So basically, they all unpack to something which exists already. So at the moment, there's obviously absolutely no reason at all to be using these things in production because they only work in Firefox. I think, and what I've sort of said in the things I've written about this, is that it's useful in terms of the way we think about and teach this stuff. Because actually that's a really good clarification that, when you think about it, what am I doing with the display property? Well, I'm either changing the main box that I've applied this to be block or inline. Just like when you first learn CSS and you're like, oh, this is a block thing, but I can say display inline, it becomes an inline thing. And that's like the first thing you learn. We understand that, but that actually matters when we're dealing with Flexbox or Grid because you've still got a block level or inline level box. It's the children then that behave differently. So I think it's like a useful clarification. And even if we can't actually use the syntax for a while, it's a good way to explain it, which I think is interesting. And the fact that we're kind of doing this all over CSS, this kind of refactoring and making it more sensible and easier to talk about. And that's kind of a big thing that's going on.
I think CSS specs are trying to move from single properties with multiple values to separate properties like background. Shorthand property, you can express it with multiple background sizing, background size and background repeat and things like that. Will we also have separate property for display? Because you're right now, when you're setting display, you're setting two values. Would it possible to display outside, display inside?
Well, that's kind of what the two values do. They are giving, but I don't think we'll ever break them down into two separate things because there's no real reason. You've kind of got to have both things to have a box anyway. So there's no real reason to split them down any further. I think it's a nice refactoring, and it does sort of explain how various things work. Stuff like if we've got like display flow root, which basically starts a whole new block formatting context. So it contains floats, it contains margins. So that's essentially display block flow root. If you think about display inline block, that's actually an inline flow root. And so its new value will be display inline flow root. If you do an inline block, it does the same thing. It contains everything. So, I think it just sort of, there's a whole bunch of stuff in CSS that's always been a bit of a mystery,
But Flex is also containing floats. So
yes, because that's a flex formatting context, which kind of behaves a bit like a block formatting context, but slightly differently.
But if it's display flex, does it mean it's display block, flex, and flow root?
No, because flex items are just once you get to the so you've said display block flex. You've got a block box with flex items. The flex items themselves, their behavior is defined in the Flexbox spec because that item then becomes a flex item. And so one of the things a flex item does is it contains floats and all this sort of stuff.
Since it's already described in the spec.
Yeah, so it's kind of display is sort of the kind of parent of all those things, and then the actual behavior of the items themselves is defined in another spec because what we've tried to do since CSS2 is not have one mega spec that contains everything.
That was a good idea.
And then that's happening all the time. Like a lot of stuff, like the alignment properties that started life in Flexbox now are in their own spec, so they can be used by Grid, and so.
And gap, is it in different spec?
Gap is also in alignment, so it's in box alignment, because it's to do with that space distribution and things.
That makes sense. Imagine redesigning multiple column layout spec from ground up. Wouldn't it be display multi-column?
Quite possibly, yes. But at this point, that ship has sailed. There's a wonderful wiki post on the CSS Working Group site, which is basically the mistakes.
I've seen that.
So the mistakes that are in CSS that the working group are going to fix once we've invented time travel. And there's a whole bunch of that sort of stuff, things that are named weirdly. But that's the thing with the web. Once things have got out onto the web, we can't take them back.
I hate current color thing.
Right. So there's just
camel case.
Yeah. I mean, that's it. There's a whole bunch of stuff which you just think, why is that weird? And usually it's weird because when it was designed, no one was thinking about, the future and seeing what the future was going to be like,
But, I look at the modern spec and they all trying to not just create new stuff, but also improve old one. Like, for example, new color formats like RGB. So you can use not just dot something value, but you can also use percentage. And it's not backward compatible.
No. But I think we can change it. We can add aliases for stuff, and we do that sometimes, and that's possible. But the old thing kind of has to hang around because we can't ever get rid of it because we'll break the web.
Yeah, but
so we can layer on top of.
Yes.
A bit like this display stuff. Those old display property values will never ever go away. They will be in browsers, forever.
Yeah, it's going to stay with us forever.
But it might be that people start using. In practice, everyone in 10 years' time might be using the two values and not really ever thinking about the old values. But they'll be there because the website that I built in 2002 that's still live, that's still going to work. And I think that's a wonderful thing about CSS and the web, that we don't break the web. I think
isn't it something for tools to take care of?
Yes, it can. It can be. I think you could quite easily start writing the new two value syntax and have that, sort of patch back. I mean, in fact, it's pretty much the only thing. Since we've got CSS variables and stuff, I'm finding I really don't need to use a lot of processing on my CSS files, because a lot of the stuff that I was using Sass for, I'm like, I don't actually need to do that anymore.
I stopped using preprocessors like a year ago, and that's enough for me. Like for variables, the only thing I miss those are using some sort of variables in media queries because they're not real properties.
That's it. I mean, but it's amazing how, and I think it's that CSS is taking on some of the stuff that was part of pre-processing. It's taking on stuff that we've typically done with JavaScript, and now we can do in CSS. And that's just a case, looking at what's happening on the web and saying, well, people are doing this thing. Can we do this better? And then that's a big part of being in the working group, or in any of the sort of designing any web platform features is looking at what people want. It's very much akin to working on a product, and which I have lots of experience of, and I see those parallels all the time. That it's, well, what do people need? What are the use cases? What are they going to use it for? How are they going to misuse this? That it's that, and that's exactly what you do when you have any product. It's just that the stakes are an awful lot higher when you're talking about the web platform.
Just like you said in the beginning, it's probably hard for regular developers or even experienced developers to join W3C and influence the spec. But as for giving feedback to CSS working group, for example, what would be the best way for regular developers? Not just complain on Twitter, but...
Yeah, I mean, so all of our issues are on GitHub. The CSS working group just has a GitHub repo, which is actually where all the specs are. So if I push a change to multicol, it just goes into that GitHub repo and it's built from there. But we also have a huge list of issues against specs raised there, which anyone can raise an issue or go and have a look and see what issues are already raised and comment on them. That's useful because this process is relatively slow. In fact, it's often very slow because there's only a few people actually working on specs. And then we need to have buy-in from user agents to implement the things as well before we're going to work.
Filing issues is one thing, but maybe you do need help going through issues and help from community to I don't know, to close issues or to ask for details and work like that to maintain issues.
Yeah, so I mean, it's not really like issues on any kind of project because basically these things will need spec edits, which will need working group resolutions.
All right.
So really what we use the issues for is as a discussion forum for that feature. So the best thing that people can be doing is to be going and reading the issues and commenting on them or raising new ones, or doing things like, finding a feature that's been discussed by the working group and we haven't ever come to a solution for, and thinking through it and saying, hey, well, could you do it like this? Or perhaps writing it up on the blog and getting more feedback from developers. And that's how we use the issues as more as a kind of discussion for that thing. Because once we get to a point of, okay, we've got an idea of how we could solve this, it's going to have to go back into the working group and be kind of, check with browser, if it's an addition to an existing feature or so on, check with the engineers whether that's even possible to do in their engine. There's a whole bunch of stuff that is very, very difficult. Well, in fact, it's impossible for one person to do because it needs all of these people who have different sort of parts of the case to get together to decide whether it's possible, which makes it sort of difficult for people just to come in and say, I can fix things. But what is really useful is all of the feedback, because then that means that when we start to discuss it, we can say, right, we've got a use case like this, and we've got a use case like this, and there's all these people want to do this thing over here. And, that, so it is very valuable. As I say, it is a slow process. And I think that sometimes I encourage people to submit things and then nothing happens for ages. And, that's just the nature of working.
But it's still valuable.
It's still valuable. We never just close things. They stay there, and typically they'll stay there until, it's like, oh, right, so someone's sort of starting up a bunch of work on grid. They're going to work on the next level of grid. And then they'll scoop up all the issues and say, right, which ones of these are really important? Right. And then we'll start working through them. Then you'll see a flurry of activity. So, it is a long game. You are not going to fix the web for your project next week. You're going to be making your life better in 2 years' time. And that's kind of how, you do need patience, but it is very valuable. It is wanted, and it's very valuable. Something actually, which is a much quicker way to get involved and actually do good things in a much more rapid way, is to get involved with the Web Platform Tests project.
Right.
So we have a test suite for all of the features. We need to have tests so that we can check that browsers actually implement them properly. That is also another open source project. You can basically get involved with writing tests.
I was thinking to organize some sort of hackathon for building tests.
Yeah, that's great. I've been digging through the test suite for Multicol. In fact, a lot of the tests actually came from Opera, back in the day. So when I took on the spec, we had a big unsorted bunch of tests to go through, and some of them now don't even apply, and things like that, So, but all specs need tests. And so that is something that really anyone can get involved with and has a much more immediate impact, because then it's like, well, that helps that spec actually progress through the process, because they can't progress until they've got all their tests. So that's another really good way to get involved. And you learn a lot about standards by writing tests.
I have a number of ideas to propose to CSS working group, so see you in issues then.
Yeah.
You were listening to a special episode of Web Standard Podcast. Thank you, Rachel, for joining us today.
Thank you. It's been really good fun. You can always follow me on Twitter. I'm at Rachel Andrew, or my website is rachelandrew.co.uk. And I'm sort of pretty much all over the web doing various things and always happy to chat.
Okay. Thank you for listening, and see you next week. Cheers.